When it comes to life and becoming a better man, do you have a firmness of mind and spirit, an unyielding courage in the face of hardship? And are you doing so with a sense of peace or even joy? These statements seem very contradictory or even impossible to coexist together, but today's guest explains how they don't have to be, that virtues rightly lived and practiced are infused with this grace and purpose. So stay with us while we go into grit, virtues, and meaning. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us on another episode of The Catholic Gentleman. We are so blessed that you have decided to join us today. We're also blessed to have Dr. Andrew Swafford. But before we talk about him, if this is your first time listening to us, please hit that subscribe button wherever you are. If you're on YouTube, definitely hit that bell button. Also, if you've listened to us multiple times, I know we've got thousands of listeners that listen to us frequently. If you write us a review on Apple or Spotify, these things go a long way in helping the algorithm so that we can reach more men. We would be grateful. You are in our prayers. And then the final thing is, if you're looking to support the Catholic Gentleman, we have finally launched the Catholic Gentleman Plus, which is a program for you. It is a program geared towards helping you understand your identity, helping you understand your masculinity, and helping you understand how to grow in holiness. It is put forth in such a way that we've got new content coming out every single month, multiple times a month, with all programmatic, but also geared into three different pillars that we talk about for the lives of men. So it's been years and hundreds of hours in the making. We couldn't be more blessed to have launched it right on the heels of coming up on our 10th anniversary next month, or the month of July. So anyways, again, so grateful that you're listening to us. Head over to CatholicGentlemanPlus.com. If you are a wife or a mother or a woman that loves what we're doing, we actually have a handful that are supporting, and Catholic Gentleman Plus, learning how to be a man is not for you. Definitely, we're grateful for your support. You can head over to CatholicGentleman.com and you can see our support button there, and there's an opportunities to give and help us continue to expand our ministry. So again, thank you so much. So diving in here today in this episode, we have Dr. Andrew Swafford. He is a professor of theology at Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. Great state. I lived in Olathe in Kansas City for a couple of years. And he holds a doctorate degree in sacred theology from the University of St. Mary of the Lake and a master's degree in Old Testament and Semitic languages from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He has co-authored and authored many books on the subjects of beauty of Catholicism, better understanding of the Bible, and the one that we hope to get into today, which is Gift and Grit, how heroic virtue can change your life and relationships. Dr. Swafford is an avid student of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is awesome, and lives with his wife, Sarah, which I'm sure many of you know, and she co-authored the book that we hope to talk about today. And there's 6 children now. He just had his 6th child, if I understand that correctly, a beautiful baby girl. Is that accurate?
That's exactly right. She's 3 weeks old today.
Oh, hot off the press. Congratulations. That is exciting. Well, I'm, again, so glad that you are here and so blessed. And I guess, how are you doing today? How is life now as you go back into the having a newborn?
You know, you forget how small they are, right? And there's a lot of help in the house now. So our oldest is 17, 16, and on down. And so it's been, we're kind of in recovery and find that new rhythm, but it's been fun to see all the other kids. And truthfully, if we didn't set a timer, I don't know if I get to hold it because my 4-year-old's the biggest hog of them all, right? So but it's been great, yeah.
And your oldest is a boy, correct?
Yep. Yeah, first 2 are boys. Yeah.
Okay, my oldest is a girl, and she just has that motherly spirit, and so she's always taken care of. Have you experienced that with your oldest son, or did it? I mean, she's 11. My oldest is 11, and she already wants to take care of him. But I imagine with a boy, it was maybe a little bit further along before that came natural for him, or did you get lucky?
Well, yes and no. So our first 2 are boys, and they're 14 months apart, so 17 and 16. And then until we just had baby Avila, we only had 1 girl right in the middle at age 12. So yeah, of course they're different, but Sarah really wanted to have girls first, just to help with the house.
It does
all
help.
These things that you think are going to come like co-natural, to them. But in many ways, Yeah, I don't know how to say it, but the boys have kind of picked up in their own way, right? It's not the
Praise
same,
God.
but we joke it. Is this you're clean or my clean? Is this?
Yeah.
So there's pick things up. The guys think it's all right, and it's not quite ready for guests, but it does the job.
That's right. It's the beauty of family life. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. So diving in here, you have a very interesting view of the world today as a professor. You have a very interesting view of the lives of men today as a professor. And so I would love for you to just start out and talk about that, right? Sam and I get it all the time. We get emails and comments daily about the struggles and difficulties in life. I always define it as men having lost their identity or even not realize they had an identity to lose. And you go in depth to it in many different ways. So I just love for you to kind of start us out as your life as a professor and what you were noticing among men and what you're doing to kind of help fill the void or correct, maybe some of this loss that men today are experiencing.
Yeah, I mean, we're really blessed to be at Benedictine. So I've been teaching here I just finished my 16th year, and we live about a block away from campus. So we see students quite a bit, and to see some 2,000 students, get to know them, it gives you kind of a firsthand view of and as things have changed. They're not the same as they were 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Things are always kind of on the move. I teach a Christian moral life class regularly. We usually read St. Augustine's Confessions to kind of start out. I teach a JP2 class, and just in interacting with them in the class, after the class, many men, many good men from good Catholic families. But then there's, we've got all kinds of students here, Benedict, and there's athletes that came here just for a sport, and so it's great to interact with all of them. But there's a fear that I won't know how to be a good husband, good father, because I didn't see it growing up. And sometimes even from good Catholic families, even very and this, I'm not speaking across the board by any means, but nobody's immune. Nobody's immune to the culture. Nobody's immune to kind of personal dysfunction. And sometimes even from, very, very pious backgrounds, there's still like kind of an emotional distance. There's, no family's perfect. And I don't mean to make light of this by any means, but it's, I've had good Catholic students say to me, can you really have a happy marriage? And they'll say, I know divorce is off the table, but is it really possible to have a joy-filled, happy, peaceful marriage at home? And so there's a lot of fear. They know what they don't want. They have an idea what they want, but they don't quite know how to get there. And they'll say, hey, how can we? I want your marriage. And then my wife and I'll say, hey, you weren't here for the first 5 years, right? You something many years later. So it's okay to be a work in the progress at the same time, but also on mission. But I see a deep fear of I don't know how to do this. And then on the other, maybe a different angle, when I teach on sloth, achadia, I mean, I have so many students like, man, I feel like you're reading my soul. We may get into that later, but this kind of spiritual apathy and indifference and lack of care that just seeps into everything else we do.
Yeah, well, I'd say you're resonating with me and my life too. When I was in college, right? Fear of failure was just led me to success. I was a professional trumpet player, but I was just afraid to be found out and found wanting. And there certainly wasn't a relationship with Christ or an identity that was found in him. So appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah. And speaking of that, obviously that I felt some of that fear as a young man, 13 years ago or 14 years ago, like getting married, having my first child, and like it all hitting me. There's these jokes about adulting, like adulting is so hard and all this stuff. Well, it really is. But I guess what I'm wondering is, when you see these young people, these young men who are struggling with this fear, what is their primary response to that? Is it anger? Is it depression? Like, obviously the two can be intertwined, but like, what do you see young guys struggling with as they feel this fear of entering into manhood, entering into the responsibilities and challenges that go with that? And what are they looking for? Like, what is the longing that they have on the other side of that fear, I guess?
Yeah, I think it depends on which student and who I'm talking to. So I think I'll just say for some of the Catholic students, there's they've been performing all their lives, right? Like you got to check the boxes, you've got to do it right, fear of failure. And so some will just kind of continue to kind of rely on just achievement after achievement after achievement after achievement. Others just fall into this kind of lukewarmness. And I mean, they're going to go to mass on Sunday. They're going to go to confession when they screw up. But there's this kind of just kind of like, just aimlessness, just this kind of wandering. Sometimes it's fear, sometimes it's anger, sometimes it's resentment. I think what they're longing for is a real sense of mission and purpose that is specific. That's not just in generalities. That's not just, pursue greatness, but like, what does that mean day in and day out? And one thing's that, I don't know, the language that, and actually I'm no Alabama fan, but I actually caught Saban in an interview saying this at one point. He said, you can't just focus on the end because there's things about the outcome. He's thinking about winning a championship that are out of your control, but you can focus on the means because those are often in your control. And I think that can be helpful, whether it's purity, whether it's different thing. Okay, yeah, I know what you want, but are you willing? I know how serious you are if you're willing to take the intermediate steps that are prerequisites to get there. And if you're not, then you're not as serious about the end as you claim to be. And then some of them just need to break down and open up and be like, I'm not okay on the inside, and it's time to just take the facade down and just be real. So it just depends on who you're talking to.
Yeah. Yeah. And if I could just jump in again, John, real quick, like this has everything to do kind of with the topic today of virtue, right? Like of developing, the word virtue comes from the Latin word for man. Like, as there's a manliness about virtue. Obviously, women can be incredibly virtuous as well, but there's a aspect of overcoming that resistance that's part of growing in virtue. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that topic. Like, what is virtue in the way that you understand it, the way the scholastics understood it, maybe even before the scholastics, the early church fathers, and it's a great tradition, right? So like, what does this word even mean? Because we know we're all called to it. We hear it all the time in like talks and, evangelical kind of resources, like trying to equip us to be saints and things like that. And yet I think very few people actually know what we're talking about when we're talking about virtue. So if you could just start there with like a definition of what virtue is.
Yeah. So like the catechism, it's a habitual disposition to do the good. I think if you go back to, we could talk about in scripture, church fathers, people like Aristotle and Plato, it's a human excellence. The arete is the Greek word there. It's, what's different between how virtue differs from values is values, demand gives something value. What do you value? I like this, I like that. But the idea of virtue in the classical context is that it's a rational perfecting of our nature as human, as rational. So virtue is never it's living the fully human life. It's never a suppression. I take courage. It's not a suppression of fear or temper. It's not a suppression of desire. It's a right ordering in accordance with our human nature as rational and free. So to simply be a slave to my appetite is to live an animalistic life. But we're not angels either, nor are we robots. So it's a mistake to kind of think that we should be that, as if pleasure is inherently bad, body's bad, et cetera. Rather, what virtue does is it integrates the whole in light of our, again, a rational nature. So that's why for like Aristotle, virtue is really one. It's diversified when you apply living in accordance with the right reason to moral decision-making, that's called prudence. To relations with others, that's justice. To feelings of fear and daring, well, that's courage. To desires for food, drink, and sex, well, that's temperance. And then he'll talk about the intellectual virtues as the perfect. So it's like you've got these powers of intellect, will, and passions, and they're perfected by the virtues. And if you leave those powers dormant, then don't be surprised that you find yourself kind of unfulfilled and unhappy. And that's kind of Aristotle's clear vision, that virtue is perfective of human nature, and it brings us to a happiness that is not merely subjective contentment, but the objective perfecting of our nature as rational, as human. And this gets just kind of enhanced in the Christian tradition in a deeper way when you bring in the reality of sin and the need for grace and the theological virtues. I think one way, though, practically, that I think I've found helpful, that I think often it can come down to this, is can I rise above my spontaneous emotional reaction in the moment and choose the good? Or will I just be a pinball? Like, can I arise above that in the moment and choose the good? And that's where I think you really see, okay, let's not talk about virtue just like when I go on the mission trip. When I go, Like, what does it mean to like live in close relations with people? Our spouses, our siblings, our roommates, like those are the people who often test our, push our buttons the most. And I think we make a mistake to think, this is another topic, but our families are the most vulnerable people in our lives, right? I mean, like if I'm mean to a neighbor, like he can be like, screw off, I don't want to be friends with you. But my family doesn't have that option, right? So I need to give my family my best. I think we need to. There's a place to be real, of course, but I think the idea that I'm just going to vent and use my family as like an emotional whipping bag is just backwards. I think that's poison. That's toxic. I think your virtue and your character are really tested often with the people with whom you live in closest proximity. Can you choose charity? Can you choose the good? And you're not going to be perfect. But to even be striving for that and to not be a slave to my emotional impulse in the moment and to continue to try to kind of harness that in accordance with the good and really in marriage, when my wife and I give marriage talks, we'll say it this way, and I'll say it to students, like, if you want this to work, you got to choose to love Jesus in your spouse, because the people you love the most, they're going to hurt you. They're going to let you down. They're going to disappoint you. And if you play the 50-50 game, it'll never work.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think that is excellent. And you mentioned a lot in there. And one of the things that we like to remind men is that, as our role as husband, father, as our role as man in society, is that we have a right to protect those vulnerable, those our wives and our children. But protection is not just the physical protection, right? Protection can take the face of protecting them from poverty, protecting them emotionally and spiritually and mentally as well. And you're exactly right. If they become our whipping bag, we're missing the mark. And so I want to actually talk a little bit backwards from what I was intended, because you already brought up a topic that I want to discuss is kind of the difference between virtue rightly understood. I think you call it supernatural grit or heroic virtue in the Christian or Catholic sense, and virtue in the Stoic or kind of Aristotle or the Antiquity, that sense. Because I do think that today in America, whether we realize it or not, we have fallen into this sort of Stoic version of practicing virtue. And you do a great job in your book, kind of breaking that down, where like it's not about pick yourself up by your bootstraps, this sort of do it anyways, even if it sucks, and really Pelagian in its essence. And so again, I would just pass it over to you and talk about that difference between how we as Catholics practice virtue, see virtue, both in the behavior and in the end goal, versus how those of Aristotle and Stoics, Seneca and all that would have viewed it.
Yeah, I think that's more Stoic than Aristotle. I think Aristotle, I mean, he's not going to go all the way here, but I think he's going to be a little closer on this. But yeah, no, you are. You're so right. And I think part of it is Aristotle doesn't know. Even Aristotle, again, even the best of classical virtue doesn't know sin and doesn't know grace. There's a line in Aristotle where he talks about, his whole point is that acts lead to habits, and over time this becomes more and more of a fixed character, to the point where he has one line where he says, "It's like you throw a stone, and at some point you've let the stone go, and you can't bring it back." And that almost makes it sound like someone is beyond redemption, right? But he's not wrong to say you can become a slave to sin. Addiction is exhibit A of this, but he doesn't know Christ, and he doesn't know that nobody's ever too far gone. But I think and maybe let me add like one thing to what I said, and let's go right to what you said here. Because part of virtue, when you really become virtuous, it's not just grit your teeth, it's you actually enjoy doing this. You can do it promptly, consistently, on demand, and with joy and peace. And so virtue is not just do the hard thing. It's become the kind of person who can do the right thing with greater and greater ease, or at least, some virtues always imply a certain pain, like courage, but it's not as difficult. Like you'd rather do it this way. Now, when you think about the Christian story and the reality of sin, to be a saint, it's not, don't just will it. Like, that's not going to work. You mentioned Pelagian. That's not going to work. What's going to work really is, and so many saints hold these two things together: recognize and acknowledge and bring to the Lord our brokenness on the one hand, and see our brokenness in light of his infinite mercy. If you just think about brokenness, you'll fall into despair. If you just think about mercy, 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 you may fall into presumption. But the two together really is where Christian hope resides. And I think what happens then when you really go to the Lord and you really open up and you say, I am a mess. And the more you do that and you sit before his presence, the more there's a deeper and deeper healing that is going to facilitate a virtuous life that's not, as you say, just grit your teeth and do it. But Lord, like when our Lord says in Matthew 5:48, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, which is a verse that creates a lot of anxiety for a lot of people. I sense, especially women, but I think really for a lot of people. But the teleos is the Greek word behind that, and the Semitic roots behind that, Hebrew and Aramaic, shalom and tamam, have the sense of be complete, whole. If you think of perfect, and really that's what's easy, it's a wholeness that's going to come through being healed and transformed and elevated. If you don't go to our Lord there, I don't think, in fact, I'm very confident. In fact, I might say, I know you're not going to live the virtuous life with peace, with joy, with gratitude. It's going to devolve, I think, at least existentially, back into this pick yourself from the bootstraps. And you're just not going to be the same husband, father, teammate, whatever it is. I love the virtue of patience, which is often considered kind of a subset of courage. So courage has the attacking soldier aspect, but there's also the courage of a martyr that can persevere and get through an evil that can't be removed. And that patience really is the virtue where we can go through this adversity and trial without losing our peace of mind, our serenity, and even a deep and abiding joy. It doesn't mean we like what's happening. Like we might despise it, but we know that we're made for something greater, that this life is not the end, and all those things. And I think we've all known people who can shoulder a teammate, like some teammates go in the tank when things go bad. Others keep their head and then transfer that to life. Well, we want a spouse, we want a teammate who, even when things go bad, like they're still with us. They still retain their ability to love in that moment. And I know for me, when I've been like overwhelmed by my stress, my worries, my concerns, I might be physically in the same room, but I ain't present, right? I ain't even there. And I think when our Lord talks about anxiety so much, and I know there's so many different kinds of anxiety, right? But just generally speaking, I think when we get so overcome, and I'll talk not clinical anxiety, things like that, but with our own issues, I think it paralyzes our ability to love. And I think part of where our Lord's coming from is there's lots of things to be worried about. I get it, but continue to turn your gaze outward toward love of God and neighbor, and never cease to love and be present to people, even when things aren't going well. And that's really hard. That's really hard to do, and sometimes impossible, but for the grace of God.
Yeah. So I just want to summarize real quick, kind of what I hear you saying, like is kind of the Stoic Aristotelian or like classical version of virtue is about habits. It's about doing something enough that it kind of works its way into your natural disposition. So you just kind of spontaneously do the right thing. You see somebody, falls on the subway tracks and you jump down in there and pull them out. You have that natural level of virtue, which is confirmed by, a lot of our neuroscience and things like that. Like your brain changes, it adapts to repeated actions, right? So it becomes easier and easier to do those things. Well, it sounds like you're saying, Christian or Catholic idea of virtue takes into account sin and grace. It takes into account both our fallenness, yes, but also God's intervention in our lives. So it's not just a human effort, but there is an element of effort and grace coinciding. But there's this idea of like infused virtues, right? Like virtues that just kind of spontaneously emerge through the grace of the Holy Spirit, and that aren't really a matter of like habitual choice, but are rather just like gifts of grace. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as kind of a contrast to the maybe Navy SEAL version of virtue or things like that, where, these guys are incredibly impressive, right? But it's at a very human, natural level, whereas we're talking about something different. So could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, no, I'm still very fond of it. And I either that natural level in that it's not complete, but I don't think it's false. And it's sort of like, anybody can hit a lucky shot, but the good player is consistent, is reliable. And when I present this to students, especially the guys, they grab onto it because then they start to see, because how often do we hear this? Deep down, I'm a good guy, despite what I did last weekend. Hey, deep down, I'm a good guy, despite what I did last weekend. And I'm like, hey, that's like saying, hey, deep down, I'm a great pitcher. I just never throw strikes, right? It's like, it doesn't work like that. And it helps you to see that who I'm going to be in 5 years is directly related to what I'm doing now. Right? Because I think the temptation in high school, college, like I'm gonna live it up now and I'll settle down later. It's like, no, it doesn't work like that. But you're exactly right, Sam. Aristotle knows nothing about the infused virtues. St. Thomas talks about the infused virtues. And sometimes people think of that as only faith, hope, and charity. These supernatural virtues, theological virtues. Why? Because they have God as their object and they're infused by God. Yes. But St. Thomas talks about infused cardinal virtues, infused courage, infused prudence. And we talk about the gifts of the Spirit, but the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians 5. So I think for two reasons why that makes abundant sense. One, we do not live in a purely natural order, right? We live in an order that was good, but that has fallen, that is in some ways under the dominion of the evil one, right? The notion of world in Scripture, like there's the good creation that God created, but then there's also, especially in John's writings, the world, which is this earthly realm over which Satan has dominion, and it's full of human dysfunction. And so because the reality is sin, we need grace even to achieve natural perfection. But then secondly, we are not called to a natural end. We are called to a supernatural end. And so we think about nature and grace. I actually wrote my dissertation on nature and grace because it's important that we don't poo-poo the order of nature, that we see the order of nature is God-given, God is behind it. The natural order in a real way is the embodiment of divine wisdom, but it gets taken up into the order of grace. It's healed, perfected, and elevated by grace. And that's really where I think what we're talking about is not just the life of virtue or maybe extending that in a broader way, but the spiritual life, which includes virtue, but it has to include prayer, repentance, the reality of my broken and fallen state, and recognizing that I can't do this alone. Not like I probably won't. I probably need help. I need some good examples. No, I mean, the Enlightenment, and it's not that there's nothing good here, but one of the dogmas they hated generally was original sin because it put like clamps on. We can't really do this utopia here. And the Catechism's got some great passages in like 387, 404 about how there are serious mistakes that we make in politics, education, and they list a couple of different things when we neglect the reality of original sin, because then we tend to think, okay, all we need is more education. All we need is more of this, more of that. And the reality, and this is what Socrates got wrong, sin is not an intellectual problem. Like I might know exactly what I should or shouldn't do. That's no guarantee that's going to happen. And ultimately, we need the gift of the Spirit to transform us from within, even to achieve this natural perfection, but we're called to something even greater. And really, God calls us to the Holy Spirit's been poured into our hearts, Romans 5:5, so that we can love. This is what charity is, with His divine love, and we can't do that ourselves. And this is what Christianity is all about: it's Christ's life, death, and resurrection being reproduced in and through each one of us, that we get taken up into this Paschal mystery. And I think, I'm sorry to yap on so much, but I think sometimes we look at the news, we're like, gosh, look how bad things are going. It's like, well, yeah, but what would you expect without Jesus? Like on the one hand, we like seeing our Aristotles, Mortimer Adler's a 20th century figure who became Catholic, as I understand, on his deathbed, but argued for God's existence for a long time as a called himself a pagan, a non-practitioner of either Judaism, Islam, or Christianity. And while those are nice, natural examples, let's be honest, right? This world is fallen, we are fallen, and we need grace, and let's not kid ourselves.
Okay, excellent. So one of the things that I want you to talk about now, specifically related to your book, is the notion of grit. Because when I heard you say grit, or when I actually think I was at NCYC or Seek, we kind of briefly talked about it for just a few seconds. And so I made the direct assumption that it was going to be about kind of like resiliency. But you guys, you and your wife, take it a step further, or just take a different angle of it. And so I would like to talk about that virtue of grit and kind of what it entails as you have realized today, and why you feel like it's so important for men today.
Yeah, and grit's a word that's gotten some traction in the secular culture in recent years, and kind of like what we were talking about before. I think people hear grit and they think that kind of stoic, white knuckle it, just grit your teeth and do it. I think where it was coming from for us in our experience with students over the years and different people over the years, sometimes there's like an enthusiasm, like I'm excited, but what happens when it's no longer convenient or popular or easy? What's going to make it have staying power? And so I think consistency was a big part of what we're driving at, of not just, kind of nodding your head at that talk or that retreat, but like, what does it mean to like really live this out long term in every vocation, every walk of life? And as you know, we took a lot from Walter Chiswick, Father Chiswick, the missionary to communist Russia, and his life is extreme in many, many ways, but there's some lessons. And so, and make a long story short, he, Jesuit, letter from Pius XI in 1929, calling for missionaries to communist Russia from the Jesuit Sons of the Church. And he just is like, I know I'm called and can't wait to do it. Goes and studies in Rome, prepares. 1938, it's deemed too dangerous to send him, so he's sent to Eastern Poland, and the Russians ended up taking over that area of Poland. And long story short, some of the people there were taking volunteer workers to support the war effort. Chiswick and other priests go undercover, basically, this is our ticket into the country, into Russia, and it's nothing's fruitful ministry wise. All of a sudden, he's arrested as a Vatican spy and a German spy. Spends 15 years in a Siberian prison camp, and it's only like in the camp that he actually begins to exercise priestly ministry. It's like this whole, I guess he could have been like, why did I ever do this? What was I thinking, right? This guy from Pennsylvania, his parents were from Poland, but he was born here, and he just never did that. He continued to see his life in light of faith, and basically, in his words, and it can be very dramatic, seeing some of these things, like fellow workers would be like, why are you working so hard for these communists? And he's like, this is my sacrifice to the Lord. And almost like seeing these things that can be onerous and burdensome, I mean, for him to the extreme, as sort of gifts in quotes from the Father that he would never have chosen for himself. But in light of faith, I'm going to embrace this and offer them back as a holy sacrifice. Now, there are certain situations where we absolutely should remove ourselves from as quickly as possible, like an abusive situation or things like that. But there's a lot of things also that are going to be kind of, I think back to when we first had, very young children, when we had 2 in diapers. I think back to learning languages, and like, it's exciting to think about learning Hebrew or Greek and whatnot before it starts. But then there's a time it's like, hey, this is not as sexy as it once was, right? So I think the supernatural grit that we're getting at, and it takes discernment, like, is this the time for that? But is to see those onerous moments, if that's the station to which the Lord has called us, as gifts from the Lord to be embraced and offered back to the Lord, not with bitterness and resentment. And that doesn't mean like, oh, I just love this. I just love this morbid thing. No. But in light of faith, I'm going to make, and it's really a lot of the virtue of patience. Can I do this with peace and with joy, and be faithful to the post the Lord has me right now, and offer this back as a holy sacrifice? I think that in one way or another is going to be key to any and every vocation, because every walk of life is going to have those lulls where it's like, it's not as exciting as I once thought it was. I'm in ministry, and man, people don't see me as the MVP that I thought I was going to be. Yeah. It's like, and it's not like, it's not about, so again, there's situations where we should remove ourselves as fast as possible, no doubt. But with discernment, if I'm called to be here, I can't just duck and run when it gets hard. Can I see this in light of faith and offer it back to the Lord? Another way to look at it, it's a lot like, if you know Ignatius, his rules for overcoming desolation, his rule 5, I think is just, it's like old-fashioned wisdom, but man, it can save a lot of vocation, a lot of marriage, a lot of big or small. And basically, it's in a time of desolation, that's not a time to make a spiritual change. Now, there's changes we should make, right? We mentioned abuse, things like that, of course. But it's so easy. I'm going to pray this way in Lent, and then it comes time to do it. It's like, I'd rather not. And Ignatius is going to say, you give in there, the desolation gets worse. But if you realize that the time of desolation is not the time of sober decision-making, that's the time of the lie. Don't make a spiritual change then. I frankly think a lot of, whether it's something small like I've committed to pray this way, or something bigger like I've been a priest for 10 years but I'm not feeling it, or in marriage, I think a lot of, I mean, the grass is the vocational grass can be greener on the side. The grass is often greenest where you water it, and I think there's a lot of truth there, again, with the sermon, of course, but there's a lot of truth there, and I think that's maybe at the heart of what we mean by grit. So the idea of gift, we worked with meaning and grit for a while. I think a lot of people, life is like a story with no plot, right? You give your life a meaning, and there's a line from Carl Ratzinger that true meaning is received, and received as gift from the Lord. That's where that first part of the house comes from. But to really live out the gift, the meaning of our lives, we're going to need grit, and not just the stoic grit, but real faithful grit in light of faith, to be martyrs in one way or another, either day in, day out, that white martyrdom, or for some of us, that red martyrdom, that you don't like the pain, but those martyrs deep down wouldn't have it any other way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that idea of gift, because you were talking about this early on in the episode where you were talking about, the people closest to you are the most vulnerable. In a sense, you're vulnerable too. Like, they can hurt you. But there's also this sense in which a lot of the culture, you look around at like weightlifting culture, or like sports culture, things like that. It's peak performance is often a very self-centered thing. So, for example, you're practicing Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I'm sure you've heard of Gordon Ryan. He's kind of like this. He's the top of the game. There's no question. Like, he's like the greatest jiu-jitsu athlete ever, maybe. So like, and yet it's so narcissistic. It's like so self-absorbed the way he talks about the sport and things like that. Maybe he would have a different opinion if you talked to him, but just kind of watching from the outside, like, it's all about him. He's all about peak performance so that he can make more money, or like he can, get more attention or things like that, and sign more deals. And like, and in a lot of the virtue that you see in the world, they don't use the word virtue maybe, but this idea of like perfecting yourself, and like, it's all very self-centered. It's so that I don't get addicted. It's so that, I can be the best version of me, et cetera, et cetera. But what you're talking about is like virtue for others, like virtue as a means to self-gift, self-possession as a means to self-gift, rather than just self-aggrandizement, or just thinking, man, I've reached the top, is it? So I'd love to hear you expand on like the idea of virtue in relationships, and how virtue can lead to happier, more rich relationships, really.
That's so spot on. That is so spot on. We revere, and I'm not trying to put down, but we revere the Michael Jordans, Michael Phelps. But I think sometimes, when we do that, we all know deep down that comes at a price, that comes at a cost, right? And I think for a lot of guys in particular, but I think men and women, but I think men in particular, you get married, you've got little kids, you've got a spouse. Like, let's not kid ourselves. Like, I can't write as many books or do as many advanced degrees. I mean, like, I would destroy my family if I did that. And the way I've often put it to myself and close friends, like, what does it mean to get an A overall? Right. So in other words, like I think sometimes we get frustrated, like, I could do so much better at this if all I had to do was that, or this, if that's all I did. But it's like, what does it mean to get an A overall? To get an A overall is to mean to have things right ordered to the right end in proper balance. And that means not everything can, bend to the altar of jiu-jitsu or basketball or trumpet or whatever it is. Like, that's not the ultimate end. God's the ultimate end. I had a friend back in the day said, hey, look, mediocrity in all things except Christ. And I'm like, that's a shocking statement, but there's some wisdom there, right? There's some wisdom there. I think, to your point, Sam, what really helped me a ton, and I take students just about every semester through Love and Possibility by Wojtyła. I think JP2, there's a slight tweak on the Aristotelian Thomistic package, where basically, and maybe more for Aristotle, at least by conventional wisdom with St. Thomas as well, there's an accent on the intellect, that the highest virtue is going to perfect our highest power, which is the intellect, contemplation, things like that. Wojtyła puts it on the will and love. And he says in a couple places where it's love that most fully actualizes the person. It's love that most fully perfects the person. There's a letter he wrote to one of the college students he helped mentor, and after she got married, and he said, and this line always hit me. He said, "I am convinced that the people that need us the most are the people we need the most." And I think what he's getting at is because it draws a greater love out of me. And so where I'm going is, for JP2, and this is really a tweak on the virtue ethic as kind of self-perfecting. And I think you're right. It can, if we're not careful, lead to kind of a self-aggrandizement, is that the whole goal is self-gift. It's Jesus Christ who teaches us the fullness of what it means to be human. Jesus reveals God to us, but he also reveals man to us. And so when the accent marks on self-gift, on love, it becomes radically other-centered and not just me-centered. And so, and I think this was transformative for me, because there's, one of the greatest crosses for me early on was like, gosh, I can't pray as much as I want to. I can't read as much as I want to. I feel like I'm not growing as much as I want to, because I've got like little children that need me, or a wife that needs, and you can start resenting your family and even seeing them as an obstacle to your holiness if you're not careful. So when the accent mark is on self-gift, when the accent mark is on love, that love fully actualizes myself, fully perfects myself, and leads to that thoroughgoing and true and authentic happiness. And this is a Wojtyła kind of accent mark. He does the same thing with chastity. So in the Thomistic Aristotelian tradition, chastity is a subset of the virtue of temperance. All right, so temperance, rightly orders my desires for freedom and sex. Chastity is about sex. Wojtyła says, well, that's not false, but chastity is better understood as a virtue that facilitates true love. It liberates love from use and prepares me and enables me to love the other for who they are, not merely what they do for me. And so it's all ordered toward love, that freedom is ordered toward love. And so I think that, for me, that was transformative, that the accent marks on love, on self-gift, that, as you said, self-mastery, which is what the Aristotelian virtue is going to help you do, is a preparation for total self-gift. But if self-gift is there, I think we won't fall into those moments of resentment that we can kind of, under the auspices, under the disguise of, I want to be holy, I want to grow. It's like, yes, but if you want to grow radically, make your life a gift.
Yeah, I think that's incredible. I love episodes like this where I know I'm going to want to listen to it again and just digest this. So thank you. So for my last question, I want to talk about a certain section in your book where basically I'm a man in my 50s, 40s, doesn't really matter, but I have come to accept that, yes, there is meaning in my life that has been granted to me as a gift from God. I have received that. I am working on grit, this grit that is both courage, perseverance, and patience, as you've discussed. But where do I begin and how do I stay consistent? You do such a great job of kind of giving some guide rails, if you will, to men when life gets difficult, when basically, and I bring this up on these shows very often, I'm praying for 2 years, but I'm just not feeling like I'm growing, right? Or that sort of stuff starts building in. So I'd love for you to speak to that. So to help men not only get started, or if they've been doing this for years, what are some guiding principles to help them stay consistent in growing and staying true, to the end goal?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I was thinking is you got to pray. And I think this can be something that gets cast by the wayside when you're all into, I want to grow, because you replace praying with reading, or replace praying with a podcast, you praying with apologetics, right? Because you feel like, well, praying, it's kind of a waste of time. Like, you don't say that, but you subconsciously think that. And I think, for me, what's the best way to pray? Well, I mean, that you do it. It's kind of like exercise. Just find what works and be consistent. But for me, that listening prayer, and even if I found it's better to have, if it's 5 minutes one day, fine. Don't let it go to waste, right? Better to have recurring, repeated, frequent, even short sessions then, well, once a week I pray for an hour, but that's it, right? That daily conversation and work it up to 5, 10, 15, 20. For me, I love it before the Blessed Sacrament. We can't always get there though. So you got to find a way to make it work consistently where you're listening, and maybe you use something as a prop, maybe read the gospel that day, but really ask the Lord, how are you calling me? How are you prompting me? What do my life needs to change? Where are you taking me? And it's not always going to be riveting, but I think if you do that over time, it'll transform your life. I think too, you need friends. Like, you need people that are going to ask you about this. Hey, how's your life going? Hey, be real. Like, we started this group 7-8 years ago, and I won't bore your audience with it, but basically it's families. We first Saturdays of the month. But one of the things that the couples do is we all share a high and a low of the month, because those are the things you don't share at a Catholic potluck. Like, you don't want to brag, and you don't share your low. And I think the thing is, like, let's be honest, like, Catholics can talk like ecclesiopolitics, like they're sports scores. Like, we're not really sharing life, right? So you got to have brothers that you can, like, be totally real with, where you're like, hey, I mean, I'm just like, I'm a mess right now. My marriage is a mess right now. Like, where are you going to go, right? So I think you need friends. I think the third thing, C.S. Lewis has got a line in Mere Christianity where he says, neither this belief nor any other will remain alive unless it's fed. You got to feed your faith. And not just with, like, encyclopedic factual knowledge. Like, you've got to continue to form yourself, feed yourself, whether it's reading, podcasts, what have you. And I think this was one of my old professors, Bishop Barron. I had him long before he was Bishop Barron, back in the day. But he gave a homily one time about 3 apostolic figures, Peter, Thomas, and John, and he took them to kind of be embodiments of 3 different aspects of the Christian life. Took Thomas to be that rational strain, I won't believe unless I can see. Took Peter to be this kind of mission-oriented, even service-oriented, and John to be the contemplative. And the whole gist of it was, well, if you only have John, the mystic might turn into superstition. And if you only have Peter, you might just be the church might just become like a service producing machine. If you only have Thomas, you might become a rationalist. They all need to rub off each other, and we probably are more inclined toward one than the other. So if you're a Thomas, make yourself do some John stuff. Read some devotionals, read some saints. If you're a John, every now and then stretch your intellect. If you're a John or a Thomas, go out and serve. So find ways to feed your faith, find friends, and make sure you're praying. And by that, I mean not just vocal prayer. The Mass is the highest prayer. But you can go to Mass every day and live a double life, right? It's been said, I think rightfully so, that that kind of listening prayer, you can't persist in serious sin and that kind of listening prayer, because that silence is just too loud, that either you'll stop praying or you'll stop saying. It's really hard to do both very long. And what I found is that if I'm consistent with that kind of prayer, it's a corrective, right? Things will sometimes veer. The prayer life won't always be riveting, but there's a self-correcting, because I'm opening the channels for the Lord to He's always speaking to me, but for me to hear it. So that's what, and obviously a sacramental life. I mean, get to confession, get to Mass. But I think those are the things, those 3 make the power of that sacramental life as explosive as it should be. Whereas the sacramental life without that often doesn't accomplish what we think it should. And I think theologically, I mean, the sacraments are efficacious signs. The grace is always offered objectively, but as the Catechism points out, according to Council of Trent, we receive in accordance with our faith and disposition. So we have to avail ourselves and open ourselves and dispose ourselves to receive the grace that's offered.
Amen. Thank you.
So just in conclusion, can you, I want to go back to this idea of you talking about like healing and wholeness. Like, it reminds me of that famous quote from St. Irenaeus of like, the glory of God is man fully alive. Like, just like this, like we often I think intellectualize virtue too much. I think that's one of the downsides of our scholastic tradition, is that we think it's just a matter of up here. But like, what does a man fully alive look like to you? Like, what does that look like? And have you met anyone like that, or encountered anyone that you would say they're fully alive?
I think so. I mean, I think we're all a work in progress this side of heaven. I think the things that come to mind, though, I'm trying to think of how to articulate this. I mean, we can give stock answers like virtue, but I think the joy, the absence of that kind of, frankly, emotional human dysfunction that can kind of beset us in so many ways, whether it's the bitterness, the resentment. I think humility is a big part of it. Real humility. And I'm partial to C.S. Lewis. I love the way Lewis puts it, that humility is about thinking less about ourselves. Because if I'm so infatuated with my brokenness, well, what am I thinking about? I'm still thinking about how bad I am. I'm thinking about myself. But humility takes my eyes off myself and enables me to focus on the other. I think that kind of humility, because this is a man who knows who he is, has joy in who he is, running toward our Lord, is not fussing about what he's not, he is present in the moment. He can be present and available and is able to love and enter into those moments in the moment. He recognizes that the present moment is really where eternity and time, I mean, this is where the Lord speaks to us at every moment. So lots of other things we could say, but to me, what stands out is not just people who are doing the right things on the outside, but like when you get closer and you lift the hood, there's a deep-seated joy and peace. The fruits of the Spirit are here. This is a person who knows the Lord, knows their strengths, knows their limitations, and is okay with that, and is at peace with that, is trying to grow and get better, of course, but not in a way that's so obsessive that's really more about self-aggrandizement as opposed to self-gift. So I know I'm kind of dancing around this. Yeah, I've seen this, but those are kind of these are the ways that it struck me as more authentic and deeper within this person than other things that just kind of looked the part on the outside, if that makes any sense. Yeah, I just worry. I worry so much because kind of as an aside, about, there's a lot of chatter on the internet, and I try to stay off. I'm on Twitter, and that's about it. But often from ex-evangelicals, but coming out of purity culture and things like that, where they had this overbearing kind of, at least their perception, rules-based view of the faith, and then they just like have revolted against that. In raising kids, for example, the teenage years, they can be challenging, but man, they've been a blast. I mean, like, I had a veteran dad say to me years ago, I was like, well, I saw about the temptation of wanting to like freeze your kids when they're young. And he's like, no, you want them to mature. And in fact, they become the kind of people that where they're not your children, you'd call them your friends. And I've experienced that with my oldest two sons for sure. And I think part of what helps facilitate that is empower them to be who they are. Right. There's a danger, I think, with us Catholics in particular, probably everybody else, but like to either try to make them a carbon copy of us or a carbon copy of we wish we would have been at that age.
Yeah.
And it's like that's poison. We want to coach them, we want to form them, absolutely, but they're God's kids, not ours. So I don't know. I think letting go of the reins of control is one of these marks of being fully alive. Like it's not a cliche, but of course you can control what you can, but I don't know. And there's I see a lot of people going after really good things, but I see the evil one creeping in where it just makes it a frenetic thing. They lose their peace and their joy. And there's like weird manipulation going on and this weird like obsession with pet projects. And I'm like, I thought something's gone right. I'm not trying to put anybody down because we want to be mission oriented, but not at the cost of our kids, our families, and the joy in the home. If we want to change the culture, we'll change the culture when our grandkids are Catholic, meaning our kids receive it with such joy that they want to replicate it. We won't do it until we can do that. And if we can be champions in the little things at home, I just think that's the key to transforming the wider scope. We want to do the missionary work. I mean, what you all are doing, this is amazing, but we got to be champions at home. And I think that is not just teaching, to your point, Sam. It's doing this with joy. It's fostering that emotional connection with our kids, our wives, our spouses. If we don't do that, the catechesis is going to fall flat. There's a study, Faith and Families, probably been 10 years ago, but their conclusion basically was what passes on the faith is not the piety of the parents so much as the emotional connection especially between the father and the kids. If that's there, they found the kids were more likely to embrace the faith of their parents.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that, Andy. It has been just joy listening to you. You can tell by nature, not only your intelligence and the time you spent looking into these things, but also that evangelical nature, right? Which is built with a solid belief, a solid love, and a solid desire to share that gift with others. So I really appreciate you doing that with us today. So where can men go to find more about you? You said Twitter, but also buy this book, and we're going to drop it in the show notes, or any of your books. I know you just came out with that new co-authored one on understanding the Old Testament and stuff like that. So feel free to share all that information, and then we'll be sure to drop all those links into the show notes.
Well, John, I super appreciate your kind thoughts and you and Sam and all that you're doing. So thank you. That means a lot. My wife and I have a website, theswaffords.com. So theswaffords.com. And we have all of our products on there as well. So Gift and Grit, How Heroic Virtue Can Change Your Life and Relationships. It's a book about relationships. I mean, there's chapters on friendship, on dating, a relationship with the Lord, but it's a book about living with meaning and purpose. It's a book about life and living it in a way that transforms all of our relationships, including and especially our walk with the Lord. And as you mentioned, I just came out with Jeff Caven's, Jeff Morrow and Biff Roca, a Catholic guide to the Old Testament. Really excited about that. I think there's nothing quite like that in terms of, it's almost 500 pages. It's thorough. Like there's chapters on every book of the Old Testament, but it's accessible. And it takes you through kind of the there and then, when was this book written, but also like, how is this book used in the New Testament? How is it used in Catholic tradition? Like, how is it used in the life of the church? So kind of bringing all those things together. But yeah, we're stoked about Gift and Grit, stoked about that one. I've got other books as well there. So those two are available on Ascension's website, ascensionpress.com. Others are available on Amazon as well. I love Jesus. I love JP2. I love the Bible. Just trying to be the donkey on which our Lord rides to Jerusalem and not get in the way, but mostly our kids. So I'm just blessed to be here. I never thought my life would look like this. And I just want to maybe all your listeners, like, God's got a plan for each and every one of you, and your mission is never in the rearview mirror. So you might be like, gosh, I wish I heard this 20 years ago, 30 years, whatever it is. There's a prayer that I came to years ago. There's about providence, and said, we think about providence often about the future, but I entrust the past, the present, the future to your providence. That was huge for me, because I think we can second guess ourselves to death about the past. Just surrender your past to the Lord's providence, that He is and did and continues to write straight with our crooked lines. Eyes forward, no matter how old you are. Godspeed.
Amen. Well, thank you so very much for all your wisdom and thoughts and sharing that with us. So yeah, it's been a joy. Thank you.
Yeah, you guys are awesome. God bless. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, you're welcome. So Sam, as we end each of our episodes,
be a man, be a saint.